for joining us in this Twitter space, a conversation between Frédéric Laloux, author of the bestseller book Reinventing Organizations, and Anna Marie Swan, reinventing those organizations on a daily basis in DAO. My name is Leen Schelvaert. I'm one of the core contributors to All for Climate. We are a nonprofit based in Brussels with the mission to help grassroots movements be as successful and as efficient as possible by creating a common infrastructure and a back office. And a couple of months ago, we decided to start a crazy adventure. We started a DAO, inspired by the way the communities behind cryptocurrencies organize. And we discovered that the parallels between the work of All for Climate, creating this network of grassroots movements, and crypto communities are huge. Decentralized, autonomous, full of transparency, cooperation instead of competition are the keywords in both worlds. And we are convinced that those two can learn a lot from each other. And we now want to connect these worlds that we believe can inspire each other, fuel each other, and definitely unite in the fight for a sustainable planet. And tonight we can listen to a conversation between those two worlds. Fred will tell us all about his new project, The Week, fully focusing on the climate emergency. And Anne-Marie will give us an insight in the exciting, new, slightly chaotic organizational structure that a DAO is. A very warm, inviting welcome to all of you. We hope you will enjoy this research as much as we do. So, I first give the word to Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, can you introduce yourself and give us a little insight into this new thing, DAOs? Why do we have to know about this?
Thank you so much, Lynn. Very wonderful, warm welcome. So I've been in the DAO, as I call it DAO, the DAO space for less than a year, but I immediately dived in and I've been exploring rabbit holes ever since. I started off volunteering with the Commons Stack and the Token Engineering Commons. Got my first paid role about 6 months ago with Dior, and then was invited into the core team at Popcorn, and I'm now moving to Popcorn full time in the new year. As with all things in this world, my life is all on hyperdrive. It's a surreal and wonderful experience because a year ago I didn't even know what a DAO was, and now I'm becoming firmly enmeshed in the space that is definitely the most creative, energizing, and fascinating entrepreneurial space I've ever been in. And with Popcorn, I have a dream job. We build simplified, high-yield DeFi strategies that create funding that goes to real-world social impact at absolutely no cost to the user. And being asked to join this chat with Frédéric Laloux is just another example of how surreally brilliant this space is. I read Reinventing Organizations about 5 years ago, and I cannot overstate how much it changed my life and set me on the path that I've been on ever since. For me, Frédéric is the father of DAOs, and I can't wait to see what he'll bring to climate mobilization.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for this short introduction. And Fred, over to you. What about this new project, The Week, that we've been hearing about? Could you tell us about this?
Yeah, well, it started almost 2 years ago. I was, happily still playing with everything that happened around this book, Reinventing Organizations. And then 2 years ago, even though, I was very aware of, obviously, about climate change, for some reason, it went a whole level deeper. Like it went from my head to sort of every cell of my body. And I think, pretty much every activist kind of knows what I'm talking about, like the moment where it's no longer something that is just in your head, but you realize like with your whole body, with, how bad things are and where we're headed. And I went through my own version of climate grief, and almost immediately it was clear that I needed to close a chapter on reinventing organizations. And the idea for The Week came up almost fully formed. I was very, there's a book I had written years ago, a woman called Tina Rosenberg. It's called Join the Club. And she talks about how the way we deal with crisis isn't working. Like the instinctive way we deal with crisis is like, give people the facts and then they will wake up and they will act. right? And she talks about how that has never worked. Like it hasn't worked against smoking up until 2 years ago. Whenever I would see a terrible headline, I would read the first few lines and then push this thing away because I felt like I'm not sure I can deal with it. So the problem is not information. The problem is to have a space where it actually feels safe enough for us to go there and potentially welcome whatever sadness or anger or grief or shock comes up, and then come out, on the other side. And so this is what we're doing with the week. I went about it kind of in the same way as reinventing organizations. Like for almost a year, I really studied all of the social science that existed, but also like all of the cool past movements. Like how did they mobilize people? And out of that comes a whole different playbook, which is that, it's not top-down information. It's actually your peers that matter. So we need to get groups together, your groups of friends, groups of family, groups of colleagues to deal with this together. And then we need to create a safe space for people to engage emotionally. What we've prototyped and tested it over the week, and the results are amazing. It looks like a lot of people are just, wanting to get out of that protective mode, out of that, like, I want to push this, keep pushing it away, if you offer them a safe space to do that. And the way we do it is, that's why we call it the week. Within a week, we invite these groups of friends, family, colleagues to gather 3 times. Every time they watch a 1-hour documentary that we script very carefully, and then they talk about it as a group. And it leads them through this emotional use. The first episode is brutally hard, everything you've been trying to avoid. But we actually create a safe space where it's okay for people to go there in the film. And then they have a conversation. And for lots of people, it's the first time with their family, their friends, their colleagues, that they actually talk about this. They show tears to one another, and it changes, it shifts the social norm. Suddenly you go like, oh, wow, I can actually talk about this with my friends or with my colleagues. And then the second episode is the bottom of the U, like, how did we get there? Is there still hope? And then the third episode is like showing tons of people who've had the courage to look, who went through this sort of grief, but came out of it with more clarity about what's important in life, more energy. Like in many ways, their lives get richer. Like suddenly they have a purpose that really matters to them in their lives. Our hope and belief is that with the week, we really can get millions of people that we weren't able to reach for the climate conversation to be deeply transformed and wanting to go there. And now suddenly you have millions of people who can do stuff and who want to self-organize. And a share of those people, might want to do this in a Web3 kind of way, and might want to join these DAOs. And so that is exciting to me, to see potentially communities emerging everywhere where people tackle different aspects of that they're excited about. Right. And it can be conservation, and it can be, financing of stuff. It can be, so all sorts of things that people could potentially do once they decide that this is, an adventure worth joining.
So here's some of the things that I think are extraordinary about DAOs. So they are so expansive. Even the smallest are expansive, and that's quite hard to explain, but every DAO is like this mini movement that's focused on a particular goal or around shared value. And there are so many different areas that are going to be worked on in that particular focus within a DAO. It's like every DAO is this kind of constellation of connections and pathways and information flows. And then bigger than that, they all sit within this larger DAO space. So you've got this larger constellation, which has also got connections and pathways and information flows. So it's like all the best of all those things that kind of we have been working towards, like networks and communities and enterprise and movements. And somehow we've managed to shove them all in this one thing. And then we've sort of said, here you go, have a go. And, I think when we set off with these things that we have no experience of, we have no imprints of anything like this. So everybody's on the same page. We're all pretty much starting new. We're all having a go. And I think that alone brings this air of maybe equality to the space. There aren't really any experts. There are some people that have spent more time, and there might be some people that are specialists in their fields, but we're all really new here. Some other things that I think are incredible when we're looking at something like a global mobilization is the levels of permeability of open source and decentralization. And what I mean by that is that access to information and access to people within a DAOs, unlike anything we've seen before. Pretty much you or I could walk into almost any DAO. We wouldn't even probably have to join. We could just find their Discord. We could walk in there. We could ask to see every document. We'd probably have access to their finances, what investments they're making, what their treasury spend is, what's their white paper. We could ask to see like the recordings of their meetings. We could ask the founder a question. And that the creativity and level of input that allows by having such permeable borders that you wouldn't see in any other organization or even any other movement. You know, a lot of movements, I think, in themselves can be quite secretive. There's a protection that comes with that. And I think DAOs switch that on its head. They say, like, the levels of transparency that some DAOs have are just floor me. And so I think that alone is just so extraordinary and really energizing.
You might remember, like in this book that I wrote, Reinventing Organizations, I talk about this new breed of organizations and using color coding that somebody used, in these teal organizations. One of the breakthroughs is that purpose is really at the heart of them, right? So most organizations have some mission statement, some vague purpose that, nobody really believes in, because their real purpose is organizational self-preservation. It's some maximization of profits or market share, and at the end of the book, I have sort of this little bit of speculative chapter where I sort of look like, this is just the early days. And if we really think that purpose might become the grounding principles for some organizations, what I speculated about is that the boundaries of these organizations might really start to disappear. Like, some people volunteer and then some people come and get paid. And actually this organization finds that another organization does its purpose better and gives part of its money to this other organization. I'm curious, like, do you start to see some of that?
Absolutely. I genuinely would say that this space is a space of cooperation in a way that I've not experienced it before. Most people in DAOs are under multiple DAOs. Really what's coming to life now is the what we call DAO to DAO collaboration, or there's DAOs being set up to facilitate literally that, just the cooperation and coordination of systems, tools, knowledge, people. There's an incredible work being done by a DAO called Prime DAO, just to give a shout out, that creating this tool that will allow multiple DAOs to fund a particular proposal in another DAO. You could be even looking, like someone from like 3 or 4 different, perhaps climate-based DAOs might all want to fund the week.
What excites me about that is when I'm thinking about the climate emergency and the fact that, we have, a number of years ahead of us, like the next 10, 15 years are going to be so decisive. And everything needs to go so incredibly fast, right? Like, we need to, tip our energy systems. We need to tip our transport system. We need to tip our food system. We need to tip, our construction system. I mean, it's crazy. And one of the things that excites me is we need money and talent to move incredibly fast. Like, we try this, after 1 month, this isn't working as expected. Let's, suddenly my talents are better used here. And then, I'm needed there. And then, I bring my friend to the table, right? And if I look at the traditional space, like even like, some amazing foundations or climate movements, they have their annual cycles and their annual grant making cycles, and they have their own self-preservation in mind. And then, who's the executive director, and then somebody gets promoted to something, but they don't have at all like the speed of this. And so one of the things that excites me is, potentially with the week, like if we, along with many others, like help to get, millions of people to wake up to this, is like having this constellation of DAOs where people can just plug in and then, pivot and move. My understanding of DAOs has evolved a bit, and I, understand very little of it. But when I first heard about, the blockchain and, then Ethereum, there seemed to me to be like almost a dream of getting human messiness out of this world by having these self-executing contracts where, it's sort of this dream that if we only set up everything right and predict everything will be easy, right? And we get human messiness out of it. So part of it felt to me like a little bit of a techie Silicon Valley naive, and that certainly still exists. But it sounds to me like some of the communities that you're in very much embrace sort of that whole human community aspect and the cultural aspect, and like the difficulty of decentralized governance, and very much recognize that we cannot force all aspects of governance up front. So that's been an interesting aspect to me. It feels to me the blockchain is just one more tool. and you can use it in sort of an orange way. If I use the colors of my book, sort of, very much in a cold, transactional, maximizing sort of way, or you can use it with whole different intentions.
Is not just one space, it's many spaces within one space. And what I mean by that is, I think the perspective that you have on the DAO space and the Web3 space very much depends about the communities and the projects that you're involved in. I came straight into this space focusing in Web3 projects that were looking at commons and public goods, and we're not here focusing just on how do we make money. But yeah, and I'll be interested maybe to put this back to you as a question, because you're right, or that most of the communities that I'm in love the humanness, right? It's just trying to create actually more trust, because by using smart contracts, you take the human aspect of, will that person do what they say will do, the treasury money, you take that aspect out. But then you bring in whole new questions about governance and how people debate around governance. So I think it's absolutely messy. The communities that I've been in have been very much focused on the human aspect and why we're here and doing this work. And it is very much a tool. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to reflect that back to you, perhaps from your learnings, because as far as I could see, all the examples in your book were organizations. They weren't communities, and they weren't looked at as communities. So they ran within this very still framework of this is a workplace, and there was an element of humanness in that, obviously. But whereas I think we're trying to do both. And I wondered what you've learned from the study that you did into teal organizations. Like, how can we bring those things into this match of community and organization?
I think a lot is new, and a lot is questions that some of these organizations have wrestled with for a long time. So I have a sense that a lot of these questions around governance, like DAOs, can learn from those organizations who've been working in self-managing fashion for 10, 20, 30 years and have figured a number of things out. And some of them might be copy-paste and others might need to be adapted. But I think it would be silly sort of to think that because DAOs are so new that everything needs to be reinvented. Because, I mean, one way to look at it is ultimately things still come down to purpose and power, right? Like these two questions. And how do we listen to purpose, and how do we best serve the purpose that is beyond ourselves? And then to make that purpose happen, or sometimes to make our own little ego things happen, power plays a role. Like who has the power to make decisions? Who has the power to allocate resources? In the new world, I think we're sure about two things. Right? We don't want the old structural hierarchies. We're pretty clear about that. Right? And we're more and more clear that we don't want the old cultural hierarchies. Like we don't want only sort of educated white males, right, to be the ones that dominate and make these resource decisions. And so it's easier to say what we don't want, right? We don't want these old structural hierarchies. We don't want these cultural hierarchies. But so what do we put instead, right? And I'm curious, we know what the DAOs are learning, and this is obviously an area where, with my old hat of reinventing organizations, I like to geek out about these things. Then do we vote? Well, I'm not sure that vote is the best option, but what else is there? One of the really interesting challenges for DAOs is how do we benefit as much as possible from liberating us from these old structures without falling into this naive optimism where we suddenly realize down the road that we have to deal with all of the same painful stuff of human messiness, of harassment and of inequalities and forms of marginalization. And yeah, so all of these things to me feel like they very much apply. And I'm curious if there's some DAOs that are already springing up to bring that into the space. What are the trainings, and how do we deal with our own biases? And because the cultural tools are just as important as the structural governance tools.
For example, the Token Engineering Commons, they have a graviton training, and that's completely based around how can we interact with each other? How do we approach conflict? How do we, as a community, approach those aspects? And in my experience, it's both something that's being talked about a lot, but it depends where you spend your time and what kind of people. And those conversations about power and where it really lies and how can we look at that is definitely happening in the spaces that I've been in.
almost always people default to consensus, right? If it's not this one person that makes a decision, then let's the whole group make the decision. And as anybody who's been trying to do consensus for a while, it's horrible, right? It's horrible because now instead of having sort of one tyrant, you potentially have dozens of tyrants because any one person can block this thing. If we don't want to make hierarchical decisions, then we try to make them by consensus. And potentially, if the group is too large for consensus, then in a DAO, we might do it by vote. Token, doesn't that sound like a right to vote? And so everybody who has a token has a right to vote. And maybe we can fit with that, and like somebody who has more tokens has more rights to vote. But vote is almost as bad as consensus because we know, just look at any sort of referendum, for people to actually make an informed decision, any one of us needs to spend a significant amount of time researching this. And almost no one has time to do this, certainly not for dozens of topics if every single decision in the company gets up for vote. And so you just shoot from the hip, or worse, you start creating sort of camps like the pro-Brexit and the anti-Brexit, and suddenly it becomes part of your identity, and then it tears the company in two. So voting is a pretty terrible mechanism. How do we get a group, informed people make informed decision on behalf of everyone else? One of the things that I, as a principle, believe in, simply because I've seen organizations that have been self-managing for a long time, all operating with some version of something called the advice process. So the principle is pretty simple, is like anybody can make any decision. So the decision is still individual. It's not a group decision, provided that they seek input from the people who have expertise, because it would be silly not to ask people who have expertise. You have to ask them and take their input into account, and the people who will be meaningfully affected, right? Because they have to have a voice in this. And then that person makes a decision, and you can mandate one person to become that decision maker and actually figure it out. If you find yourself reverting to consensus, or you find yourself looking at voting, for me, an alarm bell would go off and to go like, okay, you might need to look deeper into this, because both of these are very unsatisfactory answers.
How the DAOs apply to the week, and what are we setting up exactly, and where do we invite people into?
On my side, there's really two invitations. One is very immediate and practical, like in the next 3 days, because All for Climate, you reached out to us, to the week, right, and saying like, hey, we want to help you fund the week. Like, one of the persons in All for Climate, Xavier, participated in one of our prototype versions and was really, really, I think, deeply touched and saw the potential of this. And so he said, like, yeah. And so we, did the thing and created some NFTs. And, there's a crowdfunding, crowd sale page on Mirror. It's still live for 3 days. And you can help us fund this with, Ethereums. We have a goal of reaching 250 ETH, and with that, we would have the money to really go out there and have sort of dedicated resources to bring the week into the workplace, to bring it into churches and faith communities and universities, and really reach all of those places that are hard to reach, like outside of the usual bubble of people who are already convinced, right? And I wish I had more time and share with you like some of the amazing response we got to the prototype. Like there are already large organizations who are saying like, we don't even want to wait for your films to be ready. We want to use your rough, ugly prototypes because they're already so moving. So that's a short-term invitation. Check out the crowdfund crowd sale. We got some gorgeous little art and NFTs, and you can help us fund this. Behind this, it's a nonprofit. We again chose to do a nonprofit, so nobody's getting rich off this. It's really serving this purpose. And then beyond that, the hope is that we create this embryo of lots of people who want to mobilize and maybe use the week as this entry door to then find other DAOs out there and find their way. Like, hey, I want to do regenerative finance, or I want to do whatever else it is that you want to do, and frankly, help us build that. Like so we have a sort of a Discord that is open for anybody who has participated in a crowdfund and can join that. And you can then get access to sort of the prototype version. You can start running one of these prototypes with your family, friends, or colleagues, or inside your DAO, or anywhere else you want to run it. So see for yourself and then give us feedback, and you'll then be part of this community that gives us feedback that is always like sort of among the first to test it and help us build this. So those are the two invitations. So the short-term invitation, like if you have some ETH or some other crypto that could help make this happen, I think you'll be proud, in a year or 2 years or 3 years to say like I was among the first one. I helped to make this happen, and I maybe even got this amazing NFT for it. So that's a short term, and a longer term thing is like if this inspired you, come and join and help us create this and give us feedback and help us create a space from which hopefully lots of other initiatives emerge.
Exactly. So, and that's indeed why All for Climate reached out to this project, helping climate and grassroots movements all over Europe, but now all over the world, to be successful with their funding. And where we used to bridge grassroots movements and old school foundations, we now want to bridge grassroots movements and those new types of organizations that are so inspiring and are an adventure in itself. So indeed, we created one DAO called The Week, which you can join. It is especially a space to organize the view parties and where you're welcome to connect with people that are thinking about the topics, and where you can engage into a community, connect to each other, and find each other for conversation. Voila, we have 1 minute left. I've learned a ton again on DAOs, on organizing. It was great to hear again all about steel organizations and the book. We very much hope that you will find us in the DAO and that you will fund the project The Week so that it can get out there. We need mass mobilization to save our planet, to work together on a sustainable planet for our future. Thank you very much all for listening. We hope that we will do it again. It was the first Twitter space for All for Climate. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much, Annemarie, for being here. Thank you very much, Fred, for being here. And let's meet again in the future, maybe in the week DAO.
Thank
See
you
all.
so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
This was fun.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody listening in.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.